All right, what is going on, guys? We are here with another episode of Be the Exception podcast. We have Mather with us today, Commissioner of Grid. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
How's you have some good holidays, time off from the championship?
Yeah, got a little break snuck in there, and kept working through most of it. But overall, got some good family time, which is important to me. So,
for sure.
How about you?
Yeah, just out in Texas for a little bit, visiting the girlfriend, so it was nice.
Good.
So, do you guys even have an off season? Like, even when is it like you finish championships and then you're just like right back to work?
Pretty much. Yeah, we in that yearly cycle, all of the progress is made immediately after the previous year.
Okay, yeah.
Because by the time you're a couple of months out from the season, you're in full prep for the season. So if you're going to get any progress as far as new partnerships and things like that, that all happens, essentially right after the championship.
Yeah. So it's just nonstop then.
Nonstop. But I wouldn't have it any other way. I like it.
Right. Yeah. Well, so we've predominantly been CrossFit podcast. We obviously, had a pretty big housing of the now Atlanta Wild inside of our organization this year. So most of our listeners, we've gotten a few, and I think they probably kind of like started to gather some info about Grid. But could you just run us through like what is Grid down and dirty real quick?
Yeah, of course. And first of all, I have listened to a few of your podcasts and appreciate the coverage of Grid, and you guys do a great job explaining it. Obviously, yeah. The wild members know what they're talking about. So
right, yeah, for sure.
But even your involvement in asking the questions and stuff is great. So thanks for that. But yeah, I would say Grid League is a race-based game between two teams of half men, half women, and the players on the teams, which is about 18 players roughly, all have their unique capabilities on the team. So there's a wide range of body types, skill sets, abilities within the team. And the teams compete in a match, which is comprised of a series of races, and those races are made up of elements. So those elements could be weightlifting, they could be body weight, they could be gymnastics, they could be things like box jumps. But they usually demonstrate a dimension of athleticism that is easy to perceive. And the races are consistent in structure and rules, or match over match, but they vary by what the element is. So what the movements are that make up the races. Okay. So the races are consistent every match, and they abide by the same general rules. And then the match format is that set of movements that creates the match. And then a match is essentially like any other team sport event where there's a point winner. And then over the course of a season, there's a regular season playoff and championship. So the top performers in the regular season move on to the playoffs. And then the playoff winners move on to the championships, and there's a championship team in the league. So very similar to a traditional team sport structure in that way. Yeah. But it's that series of races that is really the main composure of what Grid League is.
Yeah. And I've been around in the, I guess you would call it, competitive fitness space since like 2012-ish time frame. So I saw, the NGPL stand up, and you were a part of that as well, correct?
Yeah, that's how we got introduced to the sport. Was me and my sister, who's my business partner now, were owners in the Miami Surge, which was one of those teams.
Yeah. And like, just to give people a little bit of history of background, like, would you mind like just jumping in and like telling people about that one real quick, and then?
Yeah, sure. So Tony Budding, who was one of the first three that created CrossFit, he was the head of media and very involved in developing the competitions for the games and everything like that. He left CrossFit to start what Grid League is now. Yeah. And it went through a couple of iterations, and we've evolved it a little bit since then. But essentially, his vision was to go big right out of the gate, and make a very entertaining TV property immediately. So we had a TV contract, we had a bunch of big opportunities, but the model didn't work for where the sport was in its progression. And so that version kind of went down in 2017 was its last season. Okay. And our first season was the same year, just later on. Or actually, I'm sorry, it was the following year. So 2016 was the last NPGL season, and then our first season was 2017.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And were you just like, hey, we'll just pick this up and run it? Because it started out in Florida, correct? The United Grid League?
Yeah. So when we left the NPGL, we being me and my sister were very much on the board of the sport was amazing. Like it was better than we even anticipated getting into the whole thing. And we put a lot to be involved. We just felt like the issue was the leadership structure, the way decisions were made, and the business structure. So the business model, essentially. So we kind of revamped that based on what we learned and started essentially grassroots. There's like two camps in the NPGL. One was like, well, we got to be more grassroots. And the other was, we got to go really big right out of the gate. And so we just took what we learned and started more grassroots. So started 2017 in Florida, very local, 6 teams, very small in gyms, and just started it that way. Okay.
And were you guys the Southern Amateur Grid League at that point in time, or was that, am I thinking of something else?
That's actually something else. Yeah, that was during the same time as the NPGL. We started out as the Florida Grid League. The United Grid League did. Okay. Yeah.
Gotcha. And do you guys have any affiliation with the amateur leagues, the amateur league that was running at the time, or?
No. There's actually been a lot of different amateur leagues that have come up and down throughout our history. Especially during the NPGL, and so that we did do a couple of pilot events at. I know what you're talking about now. We did a couple of Grid 6 pilot events in the East Grid League and the Southeast Grid League is what we were calling them. And that was pre-COVID. So that was like introductory events to like plant the seed in the region. And then COVID happened and kind of reconstructed everything.
As it did for many people.
Yeah, exactly. Especially event-based people. So we just kind of retracted back into Florida and doubled down on the things that started getting traction during COVID, and that's really what grew into the United Grid League. Okay, yeah. And so, recently, as of this last year, when I guess Dan decided to move the team, or here you guys branched out into the United Grid League, and you're more national now, correct? And you guys have a team starting up in Houston as well? Yes, there's one in Atlanta, one in Houston, and we'll have a couple of other things coming up that will be announced that, are markers of expansion nationally, we'll say. So.
Oh, okay. That's exciting. Stay tuned.
Yes, stay tuned.
Very cool. So was that always the plan? Were you guys always planning on branching out into, a national audience? Well, maybe not audience, but national like competition or...
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we always wanted to grow it into what we would call a significant sport. We feel like the concept behind the sport lends to that. It's got an original component to it in that men and women are together on the same team. And there's no other really spectator-driven sport that's like that. Pickleball is really kind of the closest thing, but it's a small team. CrossFit is also another version of a small team. But big teams, somewhat equivalent to football, doesn't really exist.
Right.
And it creates all of these really interesting dynamics that until you get really involved or watch a few matches, it's hard to understand. Yeah. Even beyond that, like behind the scenes is where the real stories take place on a team with men and women on the same team. And so we feel like there's a lot of opportunity to be a very spectator heavy sport because it is very entertaining when you peel back those layers and start to see those stories unravel. Yeah. And not only that, Tony's original vision, and I have to hand it to him, he's a visionary. He designed this sport from the get-go to be fun to watch, to be easy to pick up and to be fun to watch. And no other team sport has really done that before. It's all been designed from fun to play. People started playing golf and football and soccer because, they were having fun playing the game. Yeah. Not with the ultimate vision of being a spectator entertainment property. So all of that combined, plus the traction that we've gotten just from putting, live streams without major stars or anything on YouTube and getting good view through on them, really makes us believe that we have something here that can translate into a broader sport beyond, in the nation and maybe even globally someday, who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, we believe it has the potential to be a real spectator sport.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would you say is like the big difference between how you guys are growing versus maybe how CrossFit is growing? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's some big differences. One is CrossFit is participation first. So obviously it's a lifestyle, it's a training methodology before anything else. The sport is kind of attached to it to better demonstrate what that methodology does or bring eyeballs or attention to what that methodology does. But at its core, it's the affiliates and the training methodology that's what CrossFit is. At least that's how I perceive it. That's, for us, we are a sport. We don't have participation first. We have spectating first, essentially. So it's kind of like we're building from the audience that watches first, whereas CrossFit built from the participation that it created first.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Through the affiliates and everything like that. And so like if you had put CrossFit out on a live stream and nobody had ever done CrossFit before, it wouldn't go very far.
There'd be, what are these pull-ups? Why?
Exactly. And that's true of actually most sports, like football, baseball, etc. All started with people playing, and then because they know how to play and they care about the strategy of it and they know the nuances of it, they get engaged with the higher level of it.
Okay.
And so where we kind of look for inspiration, obviously there's some from CrossFit and how they leverage their movements and things, but we actually look closer to the UFC because the UFC, I would call a mainstream sport today.
Yeah.
But the average person that watches UFC isn't participating in UFC.
Yeah.
They watch it because it's spectator driven. There's no history behind UFC that their dad grew up, like I did as an Eagles fan. My dad had me watching the games when I was a kid, and that's how I grew up being a fan.
Right.
And in UFC, you didn't have that. You just had to have an inherently fun to watch sport for it to grow. And of course, its real pivot point or its tipping point was when it also had what goes on behind the scenes exposed to the world through its reality TV show. And so we kind of look at that as a model that we think probably makes sense for us too, because just I think what Dana White always says is, if there's a fight going on in the corner, everybody stops to watch.
That's very true.
And that's that's the reason they believe that sport was going to be successful, is because if there's a fight happening, people's inherent human nature is to stop and watch. You just can't help it. And we believe the same is true of races. So this is why expos love to have us, because when you have two teams lined up against each other, and you got intensity in the faces, and they're about to go head to head, you can't help but stop and watch. It's impossible not to, essentially.
Right.
And it's just human nature. So those two kind of concepts are important to just grabbing people and engaging them and having them in watch a part of the competition without really knowing anything about who's playing or how it even really works. It just feeds on that inherent human nature.
Yeah. And so obviously you guys are trying to model off of UFC, like you said. But they're very much like a predominant individual athlete component sport.
Yes.
How do you feel like the team aspect of that is going to help grow or draw people in?
Great question. So there's a couple things about team sports that give it a huge advantage. One is there's brand consistency year over year. So I was an Eagles fan when I was a kid. I'll be an Eagles fan until I die. In UFC, the talent constantly rotates, who the top performers are and who the stars are. And same is true of CrossFit or any other independent driven, sports property is you have to get engaged with the next person enough to, root for them or get excited about them. And they have figured out a way to do that. But the inherent advantage of team sports is that brand stays consistent. So you can hand down your fandom from father to son and mother to daughter. And that's as strong a bond with a team as you're going to develop. So I think that's a huge advantage. One. Two, the regional nature of it. So, you might engage with somebody that's from Philadelphia if you're from Philadelphia and you watch them in the UFC, but then you got to wait for the next person for that to matter from your home region. Whereas with a team sport, if you have, a home team, you're much more likely to stay attached to that home team because it represents a connection to you,
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think those are two of the huge advantages in team sports over individual sports that I really resonate with because I'm one that engages with them.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And have you seen, so like now that, it's kind of the teams are spreading out a little bit more nationally. Have you seen any one do anything like interesting in regards to like getting into the community and like trying to help grow their presence in the community?
Yeah, it's interesting because, the nature of our sport, we aren't a traditional professional sport where you have a draft and you have, people come live in an area for a period of time. Everybody oftentimes is very spread out on their team. So that's a hurdle to overcome as far as engaging, local audiences. The ones that can do it the best are the ones that are essentially located in Florida, because they might practice locally, they might, go to competitions locally, they can do events locally and things like that. So one thing, for example, one team will do is they'll kind of rotate what gym they practice in.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so it stays local, but they'll go to one member's gym, another member's gym, another member's gym, and that helps just get more brands involved. And then if people hang out to watch the practice and stuff, then they're more likely to come to a match, that kind of thing. Yeah. So that's one example. I know the Wild have done a few like training camp events and things like that, which obviously helps for the ones that do travel in locally, but
yeah. They've done a couple where they, I think it's to start the year, they'll just get together and they kind of, because they are a little bit more, spread out, I think, than most of the teams or some of the teams. So yeah, they've done a couple where they come in start of the year and just kind of do like a team bonding thing and kind of kill it in the gym for a couple days, and then they're growing a community and presence inside of that gym. So
yeah, exactly. And if people from the area come to that gym, and then the content goes out from that gym, and that helps kind of create the cohesion and the connectedness of all the brands essentially.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. That makes sense. And so, like, are you guys bringing back Grid 6? And I think I'd heard that, or maybe.
Yes. So Grid 6 was a very big part of our early on strategy, and we ran a couple of Grid 6 events in the first year of the higher level 2017, and that's where we got our initial team owners and initial athletes, and of course initial fans and initial staff as well. Grid League's really special that when you engage on a deeper level, you actually get pretty addicted to it. Like, it draws you in, and so the more people we can have participate in it, the better for the sport, for sure. Yeah. And so, part of our plan this year is to experiment with kind of a lower barrier to entry model of Grid 6. And I don't want to get too ahead of what that looks like, but it's going to be like smaller, more localized options is what we're looking at, with the goal of, if you've seen a match online or you've seen a lot of clips on social media and you're like, oh, that looks like fun, you might have an opportunity to try it out, at a very, low barrier to entry. And this is one of the similarities of CrossFit. It is scalable. So you can take any element in the Grid League and scale it to a version that pretty much anybody could do. And it still has that team component, that, high paced, high excitement vibe to it. Still a head-to-head race. And we've seen that gyms, communities have really tremendous and powerful experiences with pretty simple movements between, two teams of, just your average gym goer having a blast.
Yeah, that's awesome. Can you like dive into a little bit more about like how it's scalable? Because I think, one thing that I've seen from the past is like people talk about how the barrier to entry to CrossFit is challenging. So the actual fitness regimen isn't growing because of that. But, if you talk to them a little bit more and you explain the scalability to them, How does that work for Grid? Because you guys are doing some like even more than CrossFit is. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, and that's a big challenge of ours. Yeah. It's only a challenge for people that we want to participate in the sport, and generally that's not the primary focus. The primary focus is getting people to watch the sport. Okay. That being said, there's a ton of value to getting people to participate. So, in order to do that, we have to overcome that barrier that CrossFit also has, which is it's unattainable for the average gym goer, the average person. Yeah. And from our perspective, our audience isn't the general population in that regard. Our audience is sorry, my dog's freaking out.
All good.
Our audience is the average CrossFit gym or functional fitness gym that has an awareness of how a lot of the elements are performed and probably has some exposure to the sport in general. And the idea being like, if you're a person in a CrossFit gym and, you might not be somebody who does muscle ups yet, or maybe even butterfly chest to bar pull-ups, but you can perform a lighter weight snatch. You can, do some toes to bar. You can do box jumps. That can easily be put into a race format that just made up of elements of things that the average CrossFit gym or functional fitness gym goer can do. And so that's a pretty easy transition in the CrossFit setting. And it's just another reason to kind of like have fun with your fitness that you develop in CrossFit in another way. Yep. And the nice thing about it is, in CrossFit, if you go to a competition, you're generally expected to be able to perform everything. And everybody has their, movements they're not so good at. And part of what makes CrossFit amazing is you work through those weak points in your game to level up everything and be a better CrossFitter. But Grid kind of takes the opposite approach where, let's say, you're kind of a new CrossFitter, you're a little bit bigger, you're working on your weight, and pull-ups aren't so good for you, but deadlifts, you can rep them out like a boss, right? You have a place on a Grid League team where you can be competitive and contribute to the team performance overall significantly, even if you're kind of new and, not just kind of starting out on your journey, but you could take the fitness that you have developed and learned and apply that in a competition that's a little bit easier for a lot of different types of athletes to kind of get involved with.
For sure. Yeah. I've always kind of looked at it as like, it's actually a little bit lower barrier to entry for athletes specifically. Like, you come out of college and you're a college football player, like you're going to be able to do pretty much anything that Grid demands of a barbell, right? Yep. Same thing with a college gymnast. Like you're going to be able to do anything that Grid demands of a gymnastics movement or pick it up relatively quickly, at least. And so it almost seems like there is a little bit of a lower barrier of entry for the sport for athletes. But it is pretty cool to hear like how everything is scalable down, and like even if you've worked out in the past, you can probably have that some sort of specialty that you kind of have coming into the gym, or like you said, deadlift real fast. And you can put that into like a Grid 6 format or something like that. So,
yeah, and I would say, if you're an average gym goer and you have an interest in being competitive, it is more accessible. There is a lower barrier to entry because you focus on what you're good at. And if you're a gym owner and you want to create an experience where you have your members be able to, try competition and see what it's like, but also bridge some gaps in your community, because this is the other beautiful thing about Grid is you're on a team, and you know, if you've ever competed on a team, there's a special bond that you develop really quickly with your team. You got to come together, you got to work together, you got to figure out each other's strengths and weaknesses, you got to communicate, and you're led by a coach. And that experience is very unique. It builds strong bonds. And so like in a gym setting, you might have somebody that's a little bit higher skill and they kind of go off on their higher skill clicks, and, they're the comp team or whatever. And then you got your other just everyday gym goers. You might have your morning and your afternoons, gym goers. And you have a Grid match with accessible movements. Everybody has to come together, and it develops a different kind of bond than, a traditional in-house competition, because everybody's using what they're personally good at to contribute to the team, so that creates a different team dynamic, and B, you kind of get the chance to span groups in the grid and build a stronger community, or in the gym to build a stronger community overall by bringing people together that wouldn't normally interact too much together on a team. So it really is a pretty powerful opportunity.
That is pretty. So you're saying, like, you got what's called Rod in the corner just hammering away with clanging and banging metal plates, back squatting tons of weight. And then like Stacy, who's just come out of a gymnastics background, they like two completely different components. Maybe they don't interact that much at the gym, but then you get a grid 6 going, and it's like, oh, we complement each other really well on this grid team.
Yeah, and if you're like, for a great example is if you're a coach, and perfect example, you said you got your, and every gym's different, but you got your open gym goers that kind of see them, they have their own program, or they kind of see them, they have a certain goal, or if you can get them to come and be on a team with your everyday, just gym goer that comes in and does the class and leaves, and figure out as a gym owner, all right, how can I create a role on this team by programming the races so that my guy in the back that's competitive has his role, but Stacy over here can come in and do the box jumps, and now they're working together. Like, that's a pretty powerful click breakdown. You know what I mean? That if you're a gym owner, a lot of times you're trying to, hedge against the cliques that develop in your gym, because that's where the drama starts and everything. Right. So
start a Facebook group.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, I'm getting into the details, but like, these are the interactions that I have with gym owners that have found really positive outcomes from playing with grid in their own community.
Yeah. That's very cool. And, I think one other aspect that maybe you can touch on too is just like, because it's something that you have a specialty in, your confidence level grows inside of your fitness. And like, I coach predominantly CrossFitters, and like, when they're first starting out, all the time I hear, well, oh, this competition has X movement in it, I'm not good at this, et cetera, et cetera. And like with grid, you're like, you don't got to worry about that.
Yeah, so our number one recruitment line or phrase in the early days, when everybody's like, I don't know what the hell Grid League is, and this is in 2017 after the MPGL was gone. Okay. This is when regionals was huge too. And for regionals, a lot of people, that was their end goal. Like, they just wanted to make it to regionals as like an expression of their fitness, and then at that point, okay, whatever happens after that is no big deal. Well, every year you'd have 100 people in a region that are pretty well known, and they would not make it to regionals because of one workout, and usually because of one movement. And that's how people that were close to the top didn't break through a lot of time. Because they had something holding them back. Well, in grid, that doesn't matter. Like, you can be an absolute boss, and let's say for whatever reason your body dimensions inhibit you in muscle ups or handstand push-ups or whatever, you just give them to your teammate. And now you can go out and thrive in everything else that you're really good at. And people, when they're competitive and they realize that there's another opportunity, and don't get me wrong, like, the fact that CrossFit is like that is what makes it so amazing and hard and interesting. The fittest in the world is an incredible thing to accomplish because of that. But it leaves out a huge segment of incredibly world-class athletes that would, in any other setting, in the same room with those people, beat them in a lot of ways, but they can't get there because of one or two elements that maybe that's not even part of something they have control over. Maybe it's maybe they're tall, and then they're screwed. So I mean, like, personally, it was like the handstand push-ups. 6'2", like 225 plus, like, you're not doing great at those. But I mean, and to that point too, like, you're not asking an offensive lineman to go and play cornerback. Like, exactly.
You're asking the offensive lineman to do what he's built to do, and that's protect the quarterback and run block, right? Exactly. And so that, I think, grid is built exactly like you would for most professional sports. Like, you have a first baseman, you have they might be a power bat or whatever in baseball. So I think that's a super, super cool aspect to it. So
yeah, exactly. And the way we think about it is, like, you spend so much time and effort being competitive in a gym, and you put hours and hours and hours and hours in. Wouldn't you want more opportunities to be able to express that what you develop? And look, there's people on these Grid League teams that get, clips that go viral, and they get millions of views on things that they do that they would never have an opportunity to showcase that in CrossFit, because it just doesn't fit the same way. So it's I think there's really only positive things that come out of giving more opportunities to showcase world-class athleticism, no matter what it looks like, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, maybe to caveat off of that, showcasing the world-class athleticism, like, so this last year, you guys added a bunch of new gymnastics movements.
Mm-hmm.
You also expanded nationally. Have you guys seen growth because of that, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we started in 2017, we, didn't have a live stream, had maybe 50 people seeing our posts on Instagram.
Yeah.
And we were lucky to have, a couple dozen people come watch a match. And so, every single year, every metric has grown significantly year over year. 2021 was our first real year of live streams. So ones that we actually put effort behind, showing the whole match and whatnot.
Okay. Yeah.
And this past year we had almost 600,000 views on our live streams.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
over a 3-year span. So yeah, I mean the growth has been pretty consistent year over year. Of course, you always want to grow faster.
Right.
But we've always felt like as long as we are growing and as long as we're making progress, then we know we're doing things right. And, we try to release too much expectation on exactly how much growth we get year over year.
Yeah.
In certain metrics, but as long as, generally speaking, all the metrics we're focused on are growing, then we're doing all right.
Yeah. I think one of the most important metrics would be, how many people are reaching out and like trying to be interested about Grid. Like, and is that, have you guys seen that increase? Like with the, it seems like those gymnastics movements are like super fun to watch, super cool to watch. Like, does that start to draw people in and be like, hey, how do I get a part of this? Or how do I be a part of this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think we have like 1,200 or so people from the past 2 or 3 years that have expressed interest in playing, roughly speaking. Awesome. And then, team owners, we've had, 30 plus applications for new teams in the past couple of months.
That's awesome.
So I mean, every metric that you'd want as far as interaction in getting involved, including like staff and things like that, has continued to grow over the years.
That's awesome. That's super cool. Congrats.
Thank you.
And so I guess maybe kind of chatting a little bit more about like the gymnastics side of things, like you guys decided to add in gymnastics. So Blacklist has been kind of affiliated with the Atlanta Wild for about 2 years now. The first year, it seemed like things were very traditional grid, is how I'd classify them.
Okay.
You'd have like your ladder, triple touches, double touches, stuff like that. And then this next year, in 2024, it was like, hey, we're doing aerials, we're doing, back up rises into handstand push-ups on rings, like all sorts of crazy stuff. And so each year it seems like you're trying to progress the sport. But there's also several different elements inside of the sport. I mean, to include, the triad is extremely anaerobic, and you have that that side of the sport as well. How do you decide each year, like what you're going to progress, or where you need to take the sport in regards to new movements or new implements or something like that?
Yeah, so we're optimizing when we design new races. We're optimizing for the spectator experience first and foremost. Obviously, safety. Like we have a threshold of safety that we stay within. And for anybody who's interested, how we think about it, a max snatch. So anything that is as risky or less than a max snatch is something we'll consider putting into a race. That's how we kind of think about safety. But everything else, we're optimizing for the spectator experience. And there's a couple of different types of spectators that we're thinking about in that regard. First and foremost is the live stream spectator. So are they going to have fun watching these races be executed by these teams? And how are they going to have fun doing that? They're going to be close races, and they're going to be really easy to perceive high-level athleticism. So when you get into like the higher level gymnastics and people are doing flips and things, it's easy to tell how hard that is because the average person's like, I'm not gonna be able to do that ever in my life, And so, that's kind of why we know we're doing well when we get viral clips, when we get people writing and saying, that was amazing. These are my favorite movements. That's kind of how we start to see, and it does tend to lend towards those gymnastics higher skill movements where they lead to a lot of the comments, a lot of the engagement on live streams, and even just people reaching out and saying what they liked and what they didn't. And then also viral clips. Viral clips are a big portion of our growth strategy. And this sport was designed for the modern spectator. And a lot of the modern sports spectating goes on social media. So higher level gymnastics are well packaged for social media.
Yeah, that makes sense. So is there, so is it pretty much predominantly going to grow towards the gymnastic side in the future? Like, do you ever foresee maybe barbells becoming a bigger thing, or like faster races becoming a bigger thing? Does that kind of make sense? Absolutely.
Yeah. So one thing that I would love to do more and more of personally, because we do get, and this is more on the strength side, strongman. Strongman, we get a ton of positive feedback about watching those elements. And I used to watch them when I was a kid. The World's Strongest Man. I loved watching that when I was a kid.
The two iron, the pillars or axes or whatever.
Yeah, and like the giant stones and the pins they used to flip over and all that.
Yeah. Okay.
But so I would love to incorporate more and more of that. And then on the barbell side, honestly, like a third to a half of our elements within a match are generally barbell elements. So it's very heavy in there. The only thing is, like, the average spectator, when they see a barbell element, unless you're intimately aware of how it's performed and can notice some kind of variation of what you expect in how it's performed. So a good example, Griffin from the Wild, we posted a clip of him doing 205-pound clusters. First of all, he did it fast as hell. Like, if you know how heavy 200 pounds is, that alone is super incredible.
Yes. Yeah.
But he was cutting out extension and dropping right into the bottom of the cluster from pulling it in the ground. And that looks foreign to people. Like, whoa, something's different about that than a normal, clean or whatever, or, cluster. So those kinds of ways of demonstrating barbell movements in a unique and new way that impress people or grab attention in multiple ways, not just the athleticism and the strength of what he's doing, but the way that he's performing it are things that we kind of lean into. But like when you get up into the heavier weight, like we always want to kind of trend towards the heavier weight, because it's more and more impressive the heavier that you get. And if you are intimately aware of weightlifting, then you're going to be impressed by the bigger weights. But with the risk to reward ratio on a heavier barbell is lower, because generally speaking, somebody snatching 250 pounds and 275 pounds doesn't look that different. Whereas the difficulty level is significantly different. You have significantly less people that can snatch 275 pounds, and again at 300 pounds. But the risk that you take when you make those increases is throwing off the balance in the race, where you're giving more opportunity for one team to pull ahead in a way that the other team can't catch up to. So when the highest level strength performers on one team is a certain percentage lower than the other highest performing strength performers on the other team, you have safer opportunity to make the weight a little bit lower, because the stronger team's still going to win. But the race is more fun to watch when it's closer, because the other team can still perform it. You know what I mean?
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. And so, like, taking that concept, like, how do you apply that to, like, the gymnastics side of things then?
It's harder on the gymnastics side, but that's also, like, the risk-reward ratio is different there. So you still have the same risk-reward issue in that the higher level gymnastics are going to create a bigger distance for the team that has, higher level performers in it. However, the difference between an aerial and, a cartwheel is significant.
Right.
in the perceived difficulty of performance and how viral it'll go and how much it impresses people. So you get much more reward for incorporating a higher level movement in gymnastics than you do for heavier movements on a barbell.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And
that
it makes it worth the risk and differentiation in the race, is kind of like how we think about it.
Okay. Yep. That makes sense. And so, in regards to the strongman stuff, like you guys did implement some of that this year with the sled pulls, right? Was that new or?
Sled pulls was new, and then we had a sled push as well.
Yeah.
The wheeled sled, and then we, it's sandbag over wall isn't really strongman, but we had D balls over yoke and things like that that we've had for a little bit, but. Heavier D balls, heavier stones. I would love to have like a stone ladder at some point.
Oh, that'd be sick.
Yeah.
That'd be sick.
Yeah, because that's easy to perceive. Like when you see a big giant stone being picked up, it looks different than a heavier barbell.
Right, right. So, and you have to have basically you have to have the correct anthropometrics to even do that. So like somebody without them is definitely going to look at that and be like, "There's no way."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's and it looks more like raw and it takes less perceived technique. There is a ton of technique behind it.
Right.
But it just looks like somebody just ripping something giant off the ground. There's something like primal about that,
Yeah, for sure. Was it okay? Sorry, this is like maybe a little bit of a callback here, but were those strongman events, were those built off of like spectator experience as well? Kind of like what you were talking about, how the grid's built off of more of a spectator experience?
Are you talking about the World's Strongest Man or?
Yeah. Or is that, how did that, I guess this is like way off topic probably, but like, is that a similar kind of like concept or?
I think so, yeah. I mean, when you think about how they decide what, like they have the car deadlift, for example.
Yeah,
they could just load a bar with a bunch of weight, but the fact that it's a car makes it more impressive. It's easier to perceive, or the car drag, Or they have those giant needles that people kind of like walk their way up, but they look really hard to handle.
So
I think that's part of the magic of strongman is you make it very easy to perceive what's being performed.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it more impressive. Where, there's nothing wrong with in CrossFit, but most of the time you don't even really know the difference between, a 6-minute DT and a 4-minute DT or something. That doesn't mean much to even a pretty well performing CrossFitter.
Right.
But, picking up a car and lifting it 10 times, anybody in the world knows what that means.
Yeah, and I think you just see the struggle so much more in that too. Like even on grid, like with the ladders, like you can still see the struggle with it, or like when somebody's trying to rep out 15 ring muscle ups, like those last two get gross, and like you can see the struggle in that for sure. And I don't think you get that as much in I guess, and I hate to keep comparing like grid to CrossFit, but I feel like a lot of people just get their start in CrossFit and then they come over. Sure. So but yeah, it's definitely, I think it's definitely more fun to see the struggle. And I think you guys do a great job of like capitalizing on that.
Yeah, I agree. And it's just different. Like in CrossFit, you're testing fitness. Like you're testing how fit is somebody.
Yeah.
It's just a different goal. It's not our goal. Right. And, for the community of CrossFit, it's amazing. It's perfect.
Yeah.
But for outside of CrossFit, it's really hard to understand and perceive that. Whereas, like you said, like if you're, you're programming, 30 muscle ups in a CrossFit workout for an individual competitor or 30 muscle ups for a team, where you're going to try and do that in as few transitions as possible in a team. And you're going to try and pick somebody that's really fast, and you're going to try and reach the end range of what their capacity is, because that's the most amount of reps that you're going to get. So you said it gets gross. You can start to tell that they're close to their end, and it's also when it's the highest risk for failure, and therefore lead to a lead change that was unexpected and a plan breakdown and everything else. So it's just higher stakes all around. Like in CrossFit, you're breaking it up into 5 reps, and it's just a matter of how fast can you cycle through those sets of 5, or something like that, which is a lot less high intensity or high stakes, I guess.
You don't get the races that you do in in Grid, which like is just so much more fun to watch. Is like, oh, I can't. I think there was a couple times this year. Obviously, I predominantly watch the wild races, but I think there was a couple times this year where like, one team got to the barbell faster than the wild, and they were pretty barbell specialists this year. So, but like, the wild just repped it out way faster than them, or somebody ended up getting like close to failure and their rep speed started slowing down, and like all of a sudden somebody caught another person, and I think that happens a lot in like the gymnastics side of things as well. So it makes the races so much more fun to watch because there's so many more lead changes, and like with CrossFit it's like you're watching something for like 5 minutes and you're like, oh, there was one, like
right. And I love like going back to wild, since they're who you watch and obviously the champions, but one of the better races of the championship and one that exemplifies the wild pretty significantly is Amanda and Griffin in the second half of the partner forward are probably two of the best that you could ask for in the league, and I know that everybody's going to say that about their team, but I'm pretty sure every team would take that those two if they could in the partner forward.
Right.
And even teams with significant leads heading into when Amanda and Griffin came on had to be concerned and worried about them catching up, and oftentimes they did. And so that kind of storyline is like that consistency over time helps. In the wild, like you watch the wild, if you can beat them at partner forward, you've got a huge win under your belt because they've got Amanda and Griffin, and it's going to be hard to beat them. And those kinds of consistencies over time, I think are really one of the cool components of the sport for sure.
For sure, yeah, absolutely. So I guess one question I do have is like we both, we've been talking a lot about like CrossFit and Grid, and like they're completely different things. How do you continue to get the message across that Grid is something different than CrossFit? And like, do you think it'll ever fully separate itself from that? Do you want it to separate itself from CrossFit? Because it seems like there is carryover, but they are completely different sports.
Yeah, they are very different sports, and this is another great comparison to UFC. Because I had the opportunity to talk to the PR specialist of the UFC as it was coming up. Okay. And they always got compared to boxing. So there's a lot of similarities. You're in a ring. It's one-on-one. It's, a fight. But there's a ton of differences too, Right. And I would say we're even farther away from what CrossFit is than UFC from boxing. Yeah. The structure is completely different. However, we use some of the same movements. It's as similar to CrossFit as CrossFit is to Olympic weightlifting. So there's some movement crossover, but everything else is different. And I think the more understanding of the separation, the better. So we'll always try and communicate that. But that being said, we think we can coexist peacefully and honestly, help each other because, like I said, we are an opportunity for a competitive athlete that has a restriction that is going to hold them back in CrossFit to express what they do and even earn against it. We have people that earn sponsorship in the league and earn opportunity from that. And so we are another reason to do CrossFit, to find out. And we actually have people that don't have a lot of training background. And they come to us and say, I want to play Grid someday. And we say, well, a great place to start is in a CrossFit gym because you're going to learn all of the elements that you would eventually use in Grid League, and you're going to find out where you're best. So you're going to figure out where your skills are, where you naturally gravitate, and then you can develop those further if you want. If you don't have any idea, then obviously it's not really. You need to have a sense of what your best skills are and develop the basics before you play Grid. And it could be through gymnastics, it could be strongman, strong women, it could be Olympic weightlifting, and it could be CrossFit. But CrossFit is the most diverse option, and for somebody that has never played any of those sports, CrossFit's the best one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I know I hate doing it, but there is that crossover like you were talking about, and it does create that diversification, allows people to kind of feel out like what they are good at. And just as UFC exists and boxing exists, and like Conor McGregor came over and boxed after he was done with UFC, and like you have a lot of UFC guys that'll boxing guys that'll go into UFC. I definitely can see that there will be like a space for both sports actually.
Absolutely. And when CrossFit came around and got popular, Olympic weightlifting in the US exploded.
Yeah.
And I think it has the capacity to do a similar thing if we get to the point where, let's say we have a hit series of behind the scenes, whatever, like F1 for Grid League or whatever. I'm talking about down the road.
Yeah.
That's only going to help CrossFit, and I'm saying if we get to that point, if CrossFit continues to excel, that's going to help us. So, and look, me personally, I've been CrossFitting since 2010. And I'm a big believer in the methodology, and I'm a much better human being and a happier human being because of CrossFit.
Yeah.
And I welcome the opportunity to help it grow. And I think that, that's kind of like an ulterior motive for us, because I believe CrossFit makes a better society overall.
Totally. Yep. Yeah, I totally agree with that. So, okay. So how does somebody get started in Grid?
Well, there's a couple of ways. Most commonly, they know a player or have interacted with a player and asked them questions, and then the player directs them.
Okay.
That's probably the most common.
Okay.
The next most common is to sign up for the American Grid Trials, which is online combine.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the NFL Combine, but online. It's a series of tests. You only do the ones that you feel fit within your wheelhouse, and you submit them. There's prizes for the winners. And then teams can recruit from those. So we've had some big names come out of the American Grid Trials, including Griffin Raleigh.
Yep.
So it's definitely a great route to go. And then the last way is to reach out to teams directly. You can always do that. You just got to hope that the team is going to have an opening that is a good fit for you. But those are the three best ways.
Okay, cool. Are you guys looking? Sorry, this was just a question that popped in my head. But are you guys looking to sign any like crazy superstars like you did for NPGL, like bringing Dmitry Klokov again or anything like that?
I mean, we would always welcome that opportunity.
Yeah.
I will say that there's an Olympian gymnast that's been spoken to.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's going to come to fruition or not or whatever, but that kind of thing is great. I think it's awesome. One of the core differences in our philosophy is that we're going to grow in a sustainable way. So it's got to make sense, for the way that the sport works, compensation-wise with players and everything. And like I said, some players have really figured out how to leverage their opportunity through Grid League and earn, and they actually monetize it really well.
Yeah.
But that is directly correlated to their value in other things that they do, creating content, their reach within their gyms and their communities, and social media. So we just want to do it in a way that we don't get ahead of ourselves or get in a point where we're not in a sustainable business model. And that's one of the reasons we've been able to get to where we are and be consistent, is because we've been very focused on being sustainable.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, couple last questions here. What are the goals of Grid in the 2025 season?
Well, we want to incorporate more of a national presence. So, take those steps outside of Florida, which is, we've already started, but, hopefully we'll have some more being announced soon. And then we want to move the season up a little bit.
Okay.
So when we kind of drift back into the fall, we start to interact with hurricane season a lot more, which has screwed us a couple times now. So anytime we can avoid that is a good thing.
Right.
And then football too. When you get into the fall, it's not just football; it's hockey and basketball too.
Totally.
But all the sports start to fire back up, and we are a team sport, so we tend to appeal to people that like sports. And so when they are distracted by the other big four, then it's just less of a natural, distance that our live stream goes. So we're going to test out moving up a little bit and trying to be done a little earlier in the year and see how that goes.
Okay. Very cool. Very cool. That's a big move. That's exciting.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing is condensing. So reducing the amount of time between matches, which I think could potentially have positive effect in itself.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So yeah, we're, caveat, all the teams are involved with those decisions, and so we're still working through that as a group of team owners. But I think we're all kind of on the same page that we want to try and make that happen this year.
Yeah, very cool. That's awesome. That's exciting. That's going to be a big move, so that'll be fun to watch. Last question here from one of the owners. I would imagine you'd know who. Who do you think is going to win next year's championship?
Oh, that is a loaded question. Man, I think I don't think a lot of people would have picked the Wild in the beginning of the season last year. And especially in the second match, it didn't go so well for them. So, I think trying to pick who it's going to be is pretty futile, personally. And I don't think about it too much. I just think about, how can we, I know that sounds cliche being commissioner and all, but
very diplomatic.
Yeah. But I mean, the truth of it is I want the best team to win. And we just think about how can we optimize to make sure the best team wins in the given situation. And of course, I have an awareness of, the ability of players and I'm involved in telling the story of how good they are in comparing them to other players and whatnot. But when it comes to the individual players or strategy or all of it doesn't really matter when it gets down to the grid. It's how well do you execute as a team, and it's just impossible to predict how that is going to play out over the course of a season, and then of course even into the playoffs. So
for sure. And those matches get so chaotic. I know talking to Dan, it's well, X person can do this, X person can do this, X person can do this. I'm I sit down and watch the match. I'm that's not what happened.
Yeah. And it's just like football. When a play breaks down, what's the sequence of events? What are your progressions?
Yep.
When do you throw it away? And how do you recover? Are all things that you have to understand in Grid, which is what makes it so freaking amazing. You can go deep on the strategy, not just as a coach, but as a fan, and the Wild made a pretty big move that was quote unquote controversial in the championship, which I thought was cool. And they didn't send out a team for one of the races. Yeah. That was the first time that ever happened. And for that to be in the championship was definitely interesting. And that's something that has been debated a lot since. But, I think it's a cool component. We haven't even talked about it as a team ownership group, and I might get overruled in this, but personally, I thought, they paid a heavy tax for it. There was a 3-point swing. So they paid a heavy penalty, and, it was the right decision for them to make to be the most competitive. And, I think there's nothing wrong with that as long as it doesn't become a consistent thing where that would be an issue. But, in 6 seasons, the first time it ever happened. Right. So
I wouldn't imagine that it's going to be consistent.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, the fact that it was so heavily debated on both sides of it is great. That's what you want in sports. You want people saying that was right or no, that was cool or,
so getting that opinion in there is very important.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what sports is all about, forming opinions about how things are done and who's going to win and, why another team's not going to win. And that's what it's all about. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's, and sorry, bring it back to kind of the X person can do this. I think, and not knowing who's going to win at the end of the day. Grid is the ultimate performance sport, and if you love performing, this is the sport for you, because you go out on the floor and you have to do your job, and if you don't do your job, your team's screwed. And it's just so much fun to watch people. The Wild actually, again, kind of biased and only paid most of the attention to them, but they did a great job of learning that over the year, and to see somebody be able to do that is a lot of fun over the course of a season. And so
I think even if you're looking to go into other sports, like this one will get you prepared to go out and perform on a stage somewhere else or just out on the grid floor as well. So
100%. Yeah, the stakes are super high. And that helps you in every form of competition. If you can handle a high stakes situation, you're going to be able to handle a lot of other high stakes situations a lot better. And one of my favorite stories about the sport is we had, when I was on the Miami Surge and I was the GM, and we had this guy that he would crush it in practice, dominate in practice. Like, he was our best player in practice. He would go out on the grid and just fall apart. And, he would end up 2 reps short of where he was supposed to be, run off the grid, and then everybody's scrambling to try and figure out, how to make up for it. Yeah. And then on the flip side, Jen Jones, 4-time CrossFit Games competitor, she was the exact opposite. She wouldn't necessarily perform well in practice. Yeah. And we had this one time where, double touches were still new in the sport, and she couldn't get them. She kept trying. She couldn't get them. We had to run out, and, the guy who I just mentioned ran off, and there was like an extra 12 reps left, and we weren't sure how they were going to get done. Jen Jones runs out and just bangs them out, having never done a full set, because she's a fucking gamer, and that's what she does. Right. And that's like one of my favorite stories about the sport of like, it is such a cool opportunity because, and she always said like, having a team behind you, counting on you, just made her perform that much better, and just like it energized and fueled her. Totally. And she's one of the biggest proponents of the sport. Loved it so much. Yeah. And so there's something special about that. Like, totally, a team sport. If you've played on a team sport, you know what I'm talking about, and it tends to kind of resonate with you a little bit more. But that gets back to the point of what you said. Like, I think competition prepares you for competition in any form. But you also might just realize that this form of competition is more fun than others. For anybody. Like, I'm not going to, like, anybody who's competing for the podium at the CrossFit Games is never going to come to Grid and be like, this sport is the best for me necessarily, because it doesn't align with what they can best express their capabilities. But somebody else who, has, and there are people that have played Grid and had real shots at doing well at the games, say, you know what, if I'm going to use my time and my energy to compete, this is a better opportunity for me for a lot of different ways. And I think it's great to have both. It's just more opportunities is better. For sure. Yeah. Well, we're at a little over an hour here. I'm sure you're slammed with stuff, so we'll end this one. But any last things you kind of want to add here? Tell the audience, tell athletes, or? Well, I mean, if you made it this far, I'm grateful for that. I think that's awesome, and thank you so much for creating a platform for people to talk about the sport on the wild and otherwise. And thanks for having me to be able to talk about it, and appreciate your involvement in the sport overall. For sure. Yeah. Appreciate you coming on a little bit of short notice here. So thank you again, Mather. Absolutely. Great talking to you. Yeah, likewise. Excited to see this season. Thank you. Catch you guys next time.